Hey everyone, my name is Ken Jorgenson. I'm one of the directors here at Carr. I'm on the line today with Colin Carr, our founder and CEO. Colin, I think it's been about 3 months since we did our first COVID-related video where we answered all kinds of questions from healthcare practices around the country about how COVID and the pandemic is affecting their real estate. We got so much tremendous response and feedback from that first video that we decided to do COVID number 2. With a team of about 130 agents coast to coast. At any given time, we're helping thousands of healthcare practices. And the reason I say that is because it gives us the unique pulse, it gives us the ability to get the unique pulse of what's going on in healthcare around America, what questions they have, what concerns they have, what they're talking about. And so we've gathered a bunch of comments, a bunch of questions from our team, from our agents. And Colin, you and I are going to do a quick rapid fire and get through as many of these as we can. So let's jump right in.
Sounds great.
One of the first questions we get, one of the most common is, should I be sitting on the sidelines right now? Is Carr seeing a slowdown in deals or transactions? What are doctors and practices doing right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. The short answer is there is not a slowdown in deals right now, with the exception of a few markets that are dealing with other issues like wildfires or areas that were unfortunately completely demolished because of looting and rioting. The vast majority of the markets across the country are every bit back to where they were pre-COVID. The doctors are transacting, new offices are getting built out, people are doing deals at a very rapid pace right now.
So with that, with doctors doing deals and still transacting, are there any positives that are coming out of this season? Like if you were thinking about a project or if this is even something new to you, is now a good opportunity to actually capitalize on anything?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of things that have happened since COVID that are creating an environment that's even more favorable for doing a transaction right now than pre-COVID. Certainly, there's been things that have been very challenging, but let's talk about a couple of the things that are causing doctors to do transactions right now. Number one, the vast majority of landlords are willing to stretch further to do a deal today than they were pre-COVID. And the reason is very simple. Landlords do not want vacant spaces right now. In the midst of all the shutdowns, there were a number of retailers and other companies that did not reopen or decided to close shop after trying to struggle through the 4 to 6 months. So landlords are getting back spaces right now that they would not have gotten back otherwise. And there's a lot of larger companies and a lot of retailers that are projecting to close a considerable number of locations or to downsize quite a bit. All that being the case, landlords are preparing for more vacancy. And if they have a chance to do a new deal or keep a very ideal tenant being a healthcare provider in their space, they're going to stretch further for that deal in the vast majority of markets. You take that concept plus the idea that interest rates are even lower today than they were pre-COVID. And then the third aspect that's noteworthy is that construction costs for commercial tenant finish, so not construction for residential, new home construction, but commercial finish for healthcare providers, is down anywhere between 5 to 15% as far as costs is concerned in the vast majority of markets. Some markets might be an anomaly or might be outside of that, but in most markets, construction costs are down, interest rates are lower today than they were pre-COVID, and landlords don't want vacancy. If they can secure a long-term 5, 7, or 10-year deal, if they can keep their spaces leased, they are very motivated to do so. And that's resulting in us seeing more favorable terms than we were prior to COVID happening.
Okay, so that makes sense in terms of maybe a doctor doing a new project. What about somebody who's in the middle of their lease? Like, what are we seeing now that we're actually 6 or 7 months into this thing? What are we seeing on how landlords are working with their healthcare tenants on their lease or in their buildings?
Well, similarly, landlords, again, don't want vacant space. The vast majority of landlords were willing to work with their tenants because they realized if I don't work with this tenant, especially a healthcare provider, and I have to go back to market and release the space, it could be 6 months, 12 months, it could be 24 months before they get that space released. And so why not work with the person who outside of COVID would have had no problem paying their rent and would have been a great tenant? So good news is that most landlords have worked with their tenants, specifically healthcare providers. when it comes to tenants that are in spaces right now that have leases coming up for renewal, the same concept is there. If a landlord has a concern that they might lose you as a tenant and have to release that space, they're going to come to the table with better terms. And that's really the key. It's the same message that we have always, which is this: if a landlord doesn't have the concern they're going to lose the deal, if the landlord doesn't have a concern that you might not choose their property on a new deal, or that you might vacate their property on a lease renewal, they're not going to come to the table with as competitive of terms. If you do go to the market, if you hire professional representation, if you negotiate simultaneously with 3 or 4 landlords, and you take control of the actual strategy of creating a posture, of understanding all your options, you're going to see landlords stretching further to make a deal. And if you take the concept of you can get better financing today than you could have 6-7 months ago, you can stretch or push landlords to make better deals and give you more favorable terms. And then if you are doing any form of a build out, even a slight remodel, you're probably going to see even more competitive terms than you were pre-COVID. That's a recipe for still doing a transaction right now.
Okay, so so obviously we've been kind of talking about the lease side, landlords and tenants. Do you have any hesitation with doctors that are looking at purchasing in this season? They've been in a lease and they're looking to buy something.
Yeah, that's a great question too. There are as many purchase transactions happening right now for healthcare providers as we've ever seen before. And there's a couple of things happening. There's a significant number of healthcare providers that are purchasing their own space or their own building right now. It's a phenomenal time. Again, interest rates, we've never seen rates like this before. We're seeing lenders that will do anything from 0% down, 100% financing, at the most 10%, everything in between. We're seeing 15-year terms, 20-year terms, 25-year terms that are fixed, and we're seeing rates as low as low 3s. Again, commercial interest rates in the low 3s or even in the 4s. It's unprecedented, the opportunity that's there right now for healthcare providers. So the short answer to your question, no, healthcare providers are purchasing buildings right now at an all-time high, and there's a lot of reasons outside of interest rates. Everyone's hoping that we don't see a pandemic like we just saw in any time in the near future, hopefully the rest of our careers. However, if there is a pandemic or there's a natural disaster or there's some huge correction in the market, you have to ask yourself the question, who's going to give you more flexibility, your lender or a landlord? The answer is a lender, and here's why. Because you're going to have equity built up in the property. If you are 5 or 10 years into a 15 or 20-year loan, you're going to have hundreds of thousands or even $1 million or more of equity built up. If you do need to get some reprieve from your current situation, or if you need a breather, your lender has money built up through equity where they can help restructure your loan. They could give you several months where there's no payments. They can do a reset. They can work with you because you have the equity in the property to do so. Landlords will still work with tenants because they don't want vacancies, as we've mentioned, but they don't have that amount of money built up there. And so if you put a landlord and a lender on a scale, say which one's going to be more flexible, which scenario is going to give me better options in the future, it's almost always going to tip in favor of the lender because of the concept that you have equity built up in the property and you can restructure the loan, you can refinance, you can pull money out. It just gives you the ability to hang out longer. And typically there's some things that have happened in the market in the past with stock market correction, corporate crisis or scandal, natural disaster, war, pandemic. But typically those scenarios go past the market after 4, 6, 8, 9 months, and you have a chance to get back on your feet. A lender situation gives you more flexibility, in my opinion.
Okay, so you mentioned commercial costs a little bit earlier. Let's go into that. Commercial versus residential and stuff like that. What are we seeing around the country?
Well, it's important to differentiate between residential construction, commercial construction, and then even inside of commercial construction, you've got, large projects like universities or government projects, and then you've got tenant finished projects for healthcare providers, for restaurants, for office spaces. Here's a quick overview. In most major metropolitan markets, residential real estate and residential construction is at an all-time high. They can't build the houses fast enough. It's placed such a labor demand on the industry that construction costs in the residential world, especially new construction, are at all-time highs. So if you're talking to someone and you ask the question, tell me what's going on with construction costs, you've got to get more specific because, again, residential construction, residential new home builds, multifamily, they cannot keep up with the demand. In the commercial sector, if you're talking large projects like government projects, universities, stuff like that, most of those projects have come to a screeching halt. Why? Because all the municipalities, the governments, the cities, they are in a major budget crunch because when all these businesses got shut down or forced to close for several months, a lot of these governments and municipalities lost significant revenue. They lost the tax basis. They lost a significant amount of money that typically comes in. So they're restructuring budgets. They put a ton of projects on hold, highway construction projects, repaving roads, stuff like that. That stuff's come to a screeching halt for most governments, et cetera. Now, let's talk about commercial construction for healthcare providers. Those are the contractors that typically do restaurants, office space, et cetera. Here's the reality. There's been a huge slowdown in those deals. Healthcare providers are still transacting at a very high level, still doing new offices, but the rest of the retail and office space has slowed down tremendously. That's resulted in more favorable pricing for most healthcare providers. And then you have a couple of things that were happening prior to COVID too, that commodities and building materials started to go down at the beginning of the year for the first time in almost 10 years. You have how cheap oil is right now and how cheap oil's been. That reduces the price of steel. You've got other commodities that have been dropping in pricing as well. And so you got actual building materials that were dropping prior to COVID. And then you have the labor where the subcontractors are getting more competitive than they ever have before, or at least more competitive than they have in the last 10 years. And because of that, it's resulting in lower construction pricing in most markets by anywhere between 10 to 15%. Some markets more, some markets a little less. Either way, it's still going to be better and more competitive than what it was prior to COVID, which is a win.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go back to financing and lenders for a second. This question is regarding banks and are we seeing across the country all banks coming back and making the same kinds of loans that they were before? Talk about startup financing versus commercial real estate. Maybe give a little bit of an overview of what's going on in the financing world.
Yep. So let's break that into two categories. If you are an existing healthcare provider and you are healthy financially, the vast majority of lenders are doing business like they were before, only with even more competitive terms. They're doing no payments for the first 6 months. They're doing more interest-only payments. They are doing lower interest rates than they were prior to COVID. So if you're an existing healthcare provider and you're healthy financially, you've got a significant number of options that are, again, more competitive today than they were prior to COVID. If you are a startup, there are some lenders that are still on the sidelines that have not gotten back in the game. However, there are a number of lenders that did not stop lending to startups even during the forced shutdown. And so that's good news. So here's the bottom line. If you want to do a startup or you want to do an additional location and the opportunity makes sense, it makes sense from a market standpoint, from a competition standpoint. If it's a deal that made sense prior to COVID, it probably makes sense now as well. There's still a number of there's a number of lenders that are willing to make deals. And again, landlords are usually getting more competitive as well.
Okay. So let's talk about lease renewals for a minute. You touched on it briefly, but this question came in from a doc asking if they should be nervous about signing their lease renewal. The landlord's given them the next 5 or 10 year renewal. Should I be nervous about that? What's negotiable, or is the language negotiable, or the terms, or what's going on there?
Yeah, you should not be nervous about it. The reality is you have to have an office space. So whether you renew your lease short-term or long-term, you've got to deal with the lease renewal, or you've got to relocate and go buy a building or do something. The reality is, if you're trying to capture the most favorable terms possible, which obviously every healthcare provider is, it comes down to this. The landlord has to believe that you have other viable options. The landlord has to have a fear or concern they might lose you as a tenant. And if they do, you're going to see more favorable terms. If you approach your landlord without representation, if you approach your landlord with a blanket question of, what would you do for me? Or, will you send me a proposal? The reality is you're not going to see the same terms you would if you had a real strategy and a real posture. So the bottom line is this, you should not be concerned about doing a renewal right now. for the items or the reasons we've already listed. Lower interest rates on refinances, lower interest rates on purchases, on new loans, competitive construction pricing. Let's say you're not going to do any construction, you're not going to do any loans, and you're dealing just with your lease renewal. The reality is this: you've still got to go to the market. You've got to get other viable options. You need to have a professional advisor helping with that process. And if you do have that in place, that agent, that advisor is going to help position your deal to the landlord in a manner in which that landlord is not going to want to lose you as a tenant. And so, again, my opinion is this: if you handle the process properly, you have a chance to achieve terms that are more competitive than they were prior to COVID. If you tell your landlord, I can't move, I'm not willing to move, I'm scared to move, they're going to hit back and they're going to charge you more than you should pay. They're going to give you less concessions than you deserve. And in that scenario, if you're going to approach it that way, maybe you are a little bit more nervous because you're going to lose a lot of money.
This is actually kind of a follow-up, and you end that question on a good note in terms of this question. When we're talking about not only negotiable, the terms or the rates being negotiable and dollars and cents, what about the legal language? Have we learned anything in the last 6 months of what we've gone through? What are attorneys looking at when it comes to leases and purchases? And should there be any changes in the lease or the purchase agreement or the contract when it comes to what we've learned through COVID in the last 6 months?
Well, I'm smiling because, one of the first questions that every healthcare provider asks is, why is this lease like 70 pages? Or how come this lease is 50 pages or whatever it is? And the answer to that question is, this lease is a product of every random scenario that's ever happened between a tenant and a landlord, and trying to identify potential pitfalls or complications, and then trying to get an amicable resolution ahead of time so you know who does what or who's responsible for what. So the short answer to your question is yes. People are adding language to their leases. They're adding pandemic clauses, not just COVID. You want to be very careful not to name it by name, because COVID could morph to something else or could have a different name in the future. The reality is, if you are forced by the government to stop seeing patients, or if you're unable to operate your practice, if you can get a landlord to agree to those terms, that's incredibly ideal. It's very favorable. We're finding a lot of landlords right now are open to that. It's not going to be carte blanche. You can just, if you want to close for whatever reason, you can, and they'll let you off the hook or not charge you rent. But if the government actually comes with a forced closure to where you can't see patients, or you can see less than half of your typical patient volume, a lot of landlords are open to having some form of reprieve, whether that's deferring rent to the end of the term, whether that's working on a payment plan. They're going to find some way to help you. And so that's a very favorable idea. And a lot of landlords are willing to go with that if it means they make the deal. Again, I'm going to go back to the same point. If the landlord thinks you have no other option, no other choice, you're not willing to move, and you're just begging them to give you a clause, you might not get it. If the landlord believes that them giving you this clause is a contingency of you staying in their space or you moving into their building, you're going to have a much higher probability of achieving those terms.
Yeah, and I think I don't want to go on to the next question until we hit on the fact that you answer that question with the understanding that the healthcare practice actually has an attorney helping them. They shouldn't be putting any language together, and your broker, your agent, whoever's helping you, should not be putting any language together. It's a legal document, and and during this pandemic season, we've seen how important every word in each one of those clauses is, because of the fight back and forth between tenants and landlords. So make sure you have expert representation is the only thing that I would add into that.
Yeah, I would stamp that further. People ask the question, well, do I need to have a real estate broker? Do I need to have a good real estate attorney? And the answer is you need to have both. The real estate attorney puts on paper and makes sure that what was drafted is what was negotiated by your broker. Your broker negotiates the terms, they identify the location, they advise you, help you put together your team, and then the attorney takes what was negotiated and makes sure that what's drafted reflects that understanding. And so it's not an either or, it's both.
So this was a question we got from a number of our agents with clients that were reaching out saying, hey, with all the uncertainty of everything that we've just gone through, I don't know that I want to sign a 7 or 10 year lease. I might want to look at a 1 or 2 or 3 year lease tops. But I also want a built out space for my medical or dental practice, and I want 6 months of free rent and all this stuff. So what would you say to a doctor who's now a little bit nervous about everything they just went through and looking at a 5, 7, or 10 year lease?
I would say if you're doing a new location or a new office where it requires a full build out, if you're not comfortable doing at least a 5, ideally a 7 or 10-year lease, I wouldn't do it. Nobody builds out a brand new space, on a 1, 2, or 3-year lease. It doesn't make any sense. The reality is there's not enough margin in the deal for the landlord to give you any real concessions. A 1-year lease for a landlord in a commercial property is equivalent of like a 2-week lease in an apartment complex or in a rental. It just doesn't make sense. It's not worth their time. Most landlords would rather have a space sit vacant for an extra 6 months or a year and then lock in a 7 or 10-year lease and not have to do it again. The concern is they do a deal with someone, they're there for a year, 2 or 3 years, they move out, and then they have to release the space. Then the next person comes in and they want a different build out. They want a different layout, and all of a sudden there's this huge capital injection into the deal. You're scraping the space, renovating the space, and it just takes a long time. 6 months for a build out, a couple months of free rent once they move in, and you end up in a scenario where landlords don't want to turn spaces that many times. So they prefer waiting for longer term deals. And here's what they do in exchange for that. They give higher tenant improvement allowance. They give lower lease rates. They give larger free rent packages. So here's what I'd say. If you're looking at doing a brand new deal and you're not wanting to commit for at least 5 years, but really that's still pretty short. I would say a 7 or 10-year lease. I wouldn't do the deal if I were you. I would wait till you have enough confidence to do a long-term lease and then capitalize on the transaction. Otherwise, you're going to be borrowing an extra $50,000, $100,000, paying interest on that. And then here's the reality. You've got to start a negotiation process, even on a renewal of a space you built out a few years ago. You still have to start that process 12 months out. So you do a 3-year deal, you're starting a process to look at renegotiating it within a 1.5 to 2 years of doing the original transaction. Doesn't make any sense. If you're looking at a lease renewal and you're already in the space, a 5-year term still makes sense. If you know that you don't want to relocate in the next 5 years, or if COVID wouldn't have happened, you wouldn't have relocated, and you need that same square footage, that same type of property, do a longer term lease, get the best terms you possibly can. Because here's the reality. You can't time the market. Like, you can try to time the market, you can pretend like you can, but here's the reality. If you do a 2-year deal and the market fully recovers, and then you go to renegotiate your lease in 18 months and the market is fully recovered, and we're back to where landlords have more control over the market than they do right now, you're going to end up in a place where you're getting inferior terms. So my response is this: do the best you can with what's in your hand right now. And I would say, look at a 5 or 7-year deal and try to get the best terms you possibly can.
So talking about timing the market, let's talk about the timeline of a project. This is a question we get with municipalities and permitting offices and all that kind of stuff, construction and all that. Are we seeing any changes in the timing of a project, of a build out for a healthcare practice, from beginning to end? Is it any shorter because people are not as busy, or is it longer because of zoning and permitting offices and waiting for the government to stamp plans or anything like that?
Well, that's a loaded question, and there's about 5 different answers to that. So I'll do the best I can to answer it. Let me tell you the answer looking forward. The pipeline of deals for new construction, new development, and projects that go through the building commission and the permitting offices, those are slowing down. So if you're looking at doing a project in the next 3 to 9 months, the odds of it going faster than it had previous to COVID is very high. Over the last several months, a lot of projects were already in the queue, and some got jammed up because of government shutdowns or because of reduced staff. And so not a whole lot changed the last 6 months during COVID. However, if you go to submit a set of plans right now to get approved for permitting, construction documents, et cetera, that process is moving faster than what it was previous to COVID. And the anticipation is it's going to be even faster in the next 3 to 9 months as well.
Okay. One of the last questions, we're almost at the end here. One of the last questions, and I don't know if this specifically is going to speak to everybody listening here, but we do have a number of healthcare practices, doctors. They own their building. They've been in practice for decades, and they're actually on the investment side. Do you see any opportunities for ways to capitalize on the current market, everything going on for doctors that may be looking at buying either a larger building than they need for themselves and operating out of it, or even buying investment real estate? Anything you want to kind of speak to that?
Yeah, I would say this, the fundamentals of why you would want to buy commercial real estate for your own practice, and then if you have the ability to buy a property that has additional spaces that you could lease out, those fundamentals are still there. You've got to ask yourself the question, who are the most ideal tenants to lease space in those buildings? If it's a restaurant, you might hesitate on that one because of all the projected restaurants that are closing or going to close. If it's a space that would be ideal for another healthcare provider, that's a very viable option. And again, we're seeing a higher volume of deals right now than we were prior to COVID. So I think it really depends on what type of property you're looking at. Here's the reality. If you're a healthcare provider, you've got to have an office space. If you have a chance to purchase a building versus leasing and the numbers make sense, I highly recommend you consider that opportunity. If you have a chance to purchase a building that has an additional space or two that you can lease out to other complementary or ancillary healthcare practices, same thing, I highly recommend that you look at that. The way that we encourage people to look at that equation is this: if the spaces weren't leased, does the property still make sense? The reality is the spaces are going to get leased. The questions really are, how long will it take to lease them? What if someone moves out? If it's already leased, what if someone moves out in the future? Here's the answer. If you can make sense of owning that building without the other tenants in the spaces, then by all means buy a property that has additional spaces that you can lease out. From an aspect of how do you build additional wealth? How do you create additional annuities, additional income streams? That's phenomenal. And then I'll hit one more concept. As far as healthcare providers that own their spaces, if they want to exit that and cash out, the amount of investors that are on the sidelines that would love to purchase a leased medical condo or building, same thing, is at an all-time high. The people that buy investment property, a lot of those people haven't had a huge hit or any hit to their personal financial situation. And so most of those investors are still there and they're looking for legitimate investment opportunities. Doctors that want to cash out of their building, sell their building and do a lease back of 10 or 15 years, that opportunity is there and people are still paying top dollar for those investment opportunities.
All right. That's a lot of good information there in the last 15, 20 minutes, however long we're at. Is there anything else you'd like to say to all the healthcare practices and vendors watching?
Yeah, I would say, let's look for the positives right now. Obviously, it's been a very challenging last 6 or 7 months. There's a lot of things that have happened. There's things that are projected to continue to happen that people have to navigate. The reality is this: interest rates are at all-time lows, construction costs have come down, and landlords are willing to stretch further to make a deal today than they were prior to COVID. If you go into a transaction by yourself, hoping to achieve the best terms possible without a strategy or posture, it's probably not going to happen for you. If you hire professional representation that understands what it means to navigate landlords, to deal with the different posture, to deal with the different conflict and confrontation that landlords love to throw at healthcare providers to make it uncomfortable, if you have an advisor that can help you with that process and you go to the market, you understand your top options, you look at options to lease, you look at options to purchase, and then you actually have a game plan to capitalize, the reality is you're probably going to get better terms today than you would have prior to COVID, and that's a win.
Yeah, good place to end it. Thank you, Colin. Everybody watching, you can jump online to car.us. We'll have a link here, and there you can get all kinds of content, webinars. We have articles, a lot of additional frequently asked questions that practices are asking and wondering about. Jump online, you can find an agent in your area and continue the conversation. Colin, thanks for the time.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate it.